Morning, guys. Welcome to the 14th I Measure You Research Review. This week we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. David Opar from Down Under. Afternoon, David. How are you doing?
Yeah, well, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So, David, if you can start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and what you do and the work at Australian Catholic University, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So my background's in sport and exercise science. I did an undergraduate degree at RMIT University, which is a university here in Melbourne, as a Bachelor of Applied Science and Human Movement. And so I think I'd always had the plan to go from that degree and either try and transition into physio relatively early or finish the degree and go on to do physiotherapy. Getting through that degree, I appreciated sort of the complexity and the nuance that there was around human performance and all of the things you understand from a sport and exercise science perspective, everything and how pervasive that is in terms of so many different disciplines and sub-disciplines, where motor control, biomechanics, and then I think now even increasingly more so now things around injury prevention and injury rehabilitation as well. So I took that and sort of ran with it. Had a year. It's a very academic background, but I had a year working as an academic at RMIT, and then moved up to the QUT to work under Dr. Anthony Shield to do my PhD under Tony at QUT. So Tony had taught me at RMIT and moved up there a couple of years after I finished, and then so I sort of followed him up there, and that was probably the best decision I've ever made career-wise. So I was able to work closely with Tony day in, day out. And not only was he an amazing educator, tertiary educator, but just an incredibly knowledgeable guy and just knew so much about everything. And every time you had a chat with him, it felt like you learned something new. So went up there to do a PhD in an area that Tony had not really done a hell of a lot of work before in, but it was an opportunity to start something afresh. And we did a lot of work around hamstring strain injuries and hamstring strain injury research. So starting off with maladaptations associated with previous injury, all the way through to looking then at prospective studies, risk factors and the like. And, co-invented with Tony there an eccentric strength testing device that measures the Nordic hamstring strength in the field. And so we've done a lot of work around that space as well. After that, then moved back home to Melbourne and been at ACU now for 7.5 odd years. And so continued on with that line of hamstring strain injury work, bits and pieces with Tony, but still working closely with Morgan Williams from the University of South Wales, and then have Ryan Timmins, Jack Hickey and Narab Maniar down here at ACU with us as well, who are PhD students of mine who are now part of our broader research team. In a very, very broad snapshot, what we do is hamstring strain injury work and try to cover that off across the spectrum in terms of stuff pre-injury, risk, and prediction and interventions to mitigate that through then to elements around rehabilitation and hopefully some more work around return to play as well.
Awesome. So David, I've got so many questions in there in that background, but I'll try and stick to the main one I really want to get to. So you're the director of the Sprint Research Centre. Can you let us know how that started, what conversations were held prior to that starting, so a bit of background on the Sprint Research Centre?
Yeah, sure. So ACU is probably a relatively small university from a research perspective in Australia, but it's been punching above its weight a lot in recent times. It has a real strategy to target specific areas of research where it wants to support and be seen to be world leading, if you will. And so one of those areas, broadly speaking, is sport and exercise science research. And so they went through an initial phase 4 or 5 years ago where they brought in Professor John Hawley, who's very well known in exercise metabolism and nutrition space. John brought his lab over to ACU to really kickstart some of the exercise and sport science research field. And then on with that, there was support available to a lot of us with that research intensification strategy to really fire up the work that we were doing and have that extra support, whether it be financial, with extra students, whatever it might be. Now, because of that environment, we're just probably lucky as well that the university also took a keen interest in providing really high quality degrees in that space as well. So we have a Masters of Clinical Exercise Physiology and then an online Masters of High Performance Sport as well. And so because of those degrees, as well as the undergraduate degrees that we have in exercise and sport science and high performance sport, it attracted then a really strong nucleus of staff who had applied experience, so working at the coalface, but also obviously had the research credentials as well. And so we were fortunate enough to have people like Stu Cormack, Shona Halson, Grant Duffy, Ryan Timmins, these sort of guys already at ACU at the time. And we all knew each other and doing bits and pieces of work together. But ACU is spread geographically. We have our major campuses in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. So for anyone who doesn't know the geography of Australia, Melbourne to Sydney is about a 10-hour drive and then another 10-hour drive further up to go to Brisbane. So it's not like you can just duck around the corner if someone is at another campus to have a face-to-face meeting. And so given that ACU had built this collection of talent, there was an opportunity towards the end of 2019 to put together submissions for research centres. And we sort of had a look at the people that we had on board and how we could frame that. So we then put forward the notion of the Sports Performance, Recovery, Injury and New Technologies Research Centre, or the Sprint Research Centre, with a view to really harnessing the current expertise that we had. So performance, which is led by Stu Cormack, recovery, which is led by Shona Halson, and then injury, which is led by me, to actually bring those together into a cohesive centre and a unit. So bringing the people together to make sure we have what we think is some of the best talent of any research centre in the world in our space, but then also being able to maximise the facilities and equipment that we have as well. And our aim really is to be able to do high quality research that actually has impact in the field and the engagement they can have for practitioners as well. And we want to be probably getting to a point where we can actually be seen as a go-to centre for whether it's sporting clubs, elite organisations, future PhD students, sports tech companies. They know that we have the collection of people, skills and equipment where they can come and get a hell of a lot of stuff done and a lot of bang for their buck. So it's been a really exciting venture. It was launched, I think, in April 2020 by the university, and even through the midst of a pandemic, they've actually sort of doubled up and provided even more resources for us to make sure we can get the best possible start going. So yeah, it's a really exciting time to be an ACU, and we're really keen to make sure that people know what the centre's about, what we're doing and who's involved. Because I think it's and I sort of take myself out of this because I think there's guys like Stu and Shona who've worked in high performance sport for 15 to 20 years and have made that transition recently to academia, amongst an array of other guys that we have within the centre as well. So I just think it's a fantastic collection of people, and we really look forward to the opportunities that brings for us and hopefully for others as well.
No, that really is fantastic, and I think I've said to you off camera before, I really admire the research that's coming out of ACU. Australia in general, in fact, I think you have some of the best practitioners, researchers in the world. So it would be really good to dive in a little bit more to your arm of the Sprint Research Centre, so the injuries side of things, David. Obviously, the centre has only just opened and we are in the middle of a global pandemic, but what kind of research is being conducted? What are you looking into now? Yeah,
sure. So, I mean, just to flesh out the team, so under that injury program, and it's an injury program, but it's predominantly focused on hamstring injury research. We have a little bit of work that gets done in the ACL space as well, and that's more mechanical or biomechanically focused. But myself and then Ryan Timmins are sort of the core members of the research centre, and then we have early career researchers, as I mentioned before, Nordbord Maniar and Jack Hickey. Ryan's cut his teeth through his PhD doing a lot of work around biceps femoris architecture, the association with injury, and then how you might be able to focus specific adaptations or interventions to drive adaptations in there. Narav has done a stack of work in musculoskeletal modelling related to knee joints and ACL injuries. So it's really advanced biomechanics. If you remember any of the stuff you may have done in university with 3D motion capture, obviously IMU and Vicon are acutely aware of that space. But being able to break that motion capture data down into different compartments of the knee joint, the loading that it's experiencing, different contributions of muscles, individual muscles to loading strategies, propulsion, acceleration, those sort of things. And then Jack is our resident sort of clinician, because none of us are clinicians except Jack, but he's an accredited or clinical exercise physiologist. It may be a role unique in Australia, but it's an allied health profession that uses exercise as its major modality to treat a whole range of things from cardiovascular conditions all the way through to neurodegenerative and musculoskeletal conditions. So that's our sort of core team. We have a group of PhDs and honours students underneath us as well. So, I mean, we probably have, as I mentioned before, across the spectrum of pre-injury and post-injury, if you want to break it down in that capacity. The pre-injury side of things is around trying to understand better and identify risk better. And that, I think, inevitably leads people down the path then of injury prediction as well. And so we've done a lot of space in the risk factor injury prediction realm for hamstring strain injuries, particularly in Australian rules football. And that's partly because of our location. We have a number of teams that are relatively close to us. Within probably a 45-minute to an hour drive in normal times, you can get to 10 of the AFL teams, which is more than half the competition. So it allows us to be able to work with lots of teams and do larger studies a little bit more easily. And we tend to collaborate with teams interstate as well, or in other parts of the country too. So, I mean, it's my main interest and passion, the risk factor side of things and the prediction side of things. Not that I think that we'll ever be very good at prediction, but I think that there's a loss there in thinking that prediction is dichotomous. Either can predict or you can't. It's actually understanding how we can go about developing and building better models to understand risk. And I think about it more in terms of risk than prediction per se. Because if we think about prediction, typically we try and model somebody's risk. If their risk is greater than 50% as a classical example, then we predict that something bad or something good's going to happen. And if they're lower than that, they're in the other group. And that's almost never the case with the injury work that we do. Identifying who goes on to get injured and who doesn't. We very rarely have anyone who fits in a greater than 50% chance of injury. So we're looking to tie together the methodologies that we've sort of proven up. I mean, I should just make mention, at least before we break into some of this work, that, as mentioned, I co-invented a field test device for eccentric hamstring strength. The Nordbord, I think a lot of people are aware of it. That device has been commercialised by a company called Valve Performance, to spin out from Queensland University of Technology. And so as a result of that, I'm a small shareholder in that company. I think it's about a less than a 5% holding, I think at this point in time. And I'm chair of their research committee as well. But we've looked to use that tool, so Nordic hamstring strength, as a measure of risk, as well as the biceps femoris architectural work that Ryan's done, basically showing that short fascicles are bad in terms of your risk of hamstring injury. To tie that together with injury history, age, as well as GPS loading data, to see how well we can actually start to build out some of these prediction models. So we wrapped up towards the end of last year in a study with probably over 450 AFL players over the space of 2 years. In that window, we were able to capture about 75 hammy injuries, maybe a little bit less than that. And so that in and of itself makes it probably the second or third largest, I think, prospective cohort study in the hamstring strain injury space. What we think we should be able to do with that data is be able to start to build out and develop a more fuller understanding of our capacity to identify risk. The metric we tend to use around that is something referred to as area under the curve. If you get a measure of 0.5, the same as just randomly guessing who'll get injured and who won't. You get up to 1, and you've got a perfect model, essentially. I think we might incrementally increase our AUC values in some of these models, but we're, to be fair, never going to get probably much higher than upper 0.6s or maybe into the 0.7s on a consistent basis. You'll see studies that sort of fluctuate there, and they're in the 0.7 mark every now and again. But by and large, we're only getting incremental improvements in random chance. And that's trying to identify people at the individual level. So one of the things I'm thinking and hoping that we can do is, there's a random nature in terms of people sustaining hamstring strain injuries. So even though we might be able to identify people's level of risk, and with what capacity we can do that, I think is still questionable. But even with that information, who gets injured, how they get injured, when they get injured, the mechanism for it, there's a whole host of factors we don't or can't account for. And so there's a random nature to the who, the how, the when, the why, and those sort of things. So the alternative view might actually be trying to model risk at a squad level. So we mightn't necessarily be able to get to an individual level and say, this guy's going to get injured on this date through this mechanism. That'll never happen. But we might be able to, and clubs would love to know that, right? Because not all injuries are created equal. If a really good player gets injured, that's a big problem. And if someone who's not such a good player gets injured, that's less of a problem. We're not going to get to that point. But whether we can look at being able to model squad-wide or team-wide data to be able to say, right, your estimated number of hamstring injuries you're likely to get in this season will be between 6 and 10, based on the data we've got and the models that we can build. Can we look at what we can do in that squad then to maybe bring that number down to be a little bit lower? So can we suppress that number? So the 6 to 10 might be able to shift down to between 4 and 6. And whoever gets those 4 or 6 might still be random, but at least you're reducing the overall risk that you have in your squad. The likelihood that one of those really good players get injured is going to be reduced. So I think that's some work we want to try and sort of delve into a little more. We've got that data set there. We still do a lot of stuff looking at delivering a stimulus to try and modulate biceps femoris architecture. And as I say, that emanates from Ryan's work looking at professional Australian soccer players and the fact that shorter fascicles increase risk of future injury. And we're in the process from that AFL work and in a few other prediction studies of trying to replicate those findings, because that's always an issue for us. We've even seen that with our Nordic hamstring exercise work, that when we look to replicate our initial findings, often you don't replicate that work. So if you have a study, a single standalone study that finds maybe a medium or moderate or large effect, typically when you replicate it, at least in our space, the truth of the matter is that the effects, if they are there, are typically pretty small. And that's what we see for strength. And that's possibly the case for architecture, although I'm a little bit more bullish on the architecture front. But the view here is that if we can drive positive adaptations in architecture and understand the stimulus that are responsible for driving that adaptation, then we can give people a bit of an indication about how they might be able to manipulate some of their prescription and programming. So we've gone through the gamut of looking at concentric versus eccentric contractions. Does that have an effect? And they have very disparate and different effects on architecture. Eccentric has positive adaptations. Concentric only has negative adaptations. In our mind, I say negative adaptations. But then going through a whole host of other exercises that have different characteristics. So we've done a comparison between the Nordic and a 45-degree hip extension through Matt Bourne's PhD up at QUT. Now looking at some eccentrically overloaded hip dominant exercises using a K-box, so a yo-yo flywheel device. Does a hip dominant eccentrically overloaded exercise have greater benefits than a knee dominant short length exercise like the Nordic? And Ryan Timmons has led a lot of that work in semi-professional sport for us as well. And then other things that relate to considerations around prescription and your prescription variables. So, do you need to be hitting certain intensities, or do you have to deliver an eccentric strength training stimulus at a super maximal intensity to get benefits at an architectural level? And if you use the Nordic as an example, well, you probably do to a large extent. What sort of training volumes do you need? We found that you can probably get away with lower volumes of exposure to eccentric exercise if you have high intensities. And so you might be able to do less, and that fits with compressed schedules and the like. So there's that stream of work. And then some of Jack's work around rehab and return to play, and particularly rehabilitation, and how you can actually use a really common sense approach, what he terms exercise-specific progressions, to guiding how quickly you can move through progressions in rehab. So whereas typically people might use a clinical exam or pain during an isometric contraction to determine whether people can advance through rehabilitation. A lot of Jack's work's been about, well, can we look at lower intensity versions of a more advanced exercise to see whether we can progress people more quickly? So his classic example of using a bilateral slider or valve slide exercise as a knee dominant submaximal eccentric exercise to see whether you could then move to a unilateral variation, and then to more extreme eccentric loading strategies like the Nordic. And that work, I think, is incredibly impactful for people in the field, because it allows them to take some stuff away and actually try and implement it pretty quick in practice. So I think that's probably a bit of a snapshot of the stuff that we're doing currently. And, obviously face-to-face data collection at the minute's on hold, but a lot of work with pre-existing data sets and trying to refine and improve the stuff that we've done over a long period of time.
Fascinating, David. And then, so you've given a snapshot of what's coming as well, but in your opinion, in terms of the injury arm of sprint, where do you see the future and where do you see, the injury arm going and what needs to be done within hamstrings specifically?
Yeah. So I think there's probably a number of different ways and answers to that question. I think probably just try to focus on some of the key ones. So running's the big blind spot for us, right? As a research group, we do a lot of work on strength and structure, but high-speed running is what incites hamstring injury, and exposure to high-speed running is critically important. I think you'd find it's impossible to argue that it's critically important to expose people to high-speed running as part of a risk mitigation strategy for hamstring strain injury. The disconnect, I suppose, there is the bridge there between things like related to running mechanics. And so there is a really strong belief that running mechanics are associated with risk of injury and risk of hamstring injury. I don't discount that point. I don't see the data there necessarily to back that up at this point in time. And I think part of that is because the ability to assess running mechanics, running kinematics, running kinetics is very much lab-based. And there's a few studies that are out there in the literature. Claire Dabrowski-Kowalski, if I pronounce that correctly, at University of Canberra, and then Jocke Schuurmans, Eric Vitterow, University of Ghent. But labour-intensive studies where you can't actually get a number of people through the lab to examine their running kinematics and kinetics. And so it becomes then really hard to determine how those variables might actually be related to future risk. And when I work back to our work on strength, now we've done 3 or 4 of the prospective cohort study. There's another 2 out there. We've recently done a systematic review on it that's sort of out for review at the moment. And you get more and more certainty when you have over 1,000 participants and in the vicinity of 300 or 400 injuries to be able to compare and contrast data to. And you just don't have that in that running mechanics space. So, but there's been some great work by guys like JB Morin, looking at force velocity profiling, horizontal force velocity profiling as maybe an objective field-based measure to give some indication of probably hip extension function, and using running as the modality to collect that. So I think that the transition for us would be to do a little bit more running related research. And the big push for that would be trying to look at solutions for how we can better objectify measures of running mechanics in the field. The longer term view is then trying to probably understand, are there different clusters of individuals who run differently? And it's not to say that we're going to try and pass it down to, 3 or 4 degrees difference in knee flexion or knee extension angle during terminal swing. And that's all of a sudden the secret mark if you cross that threshold. I don't think we go towards that point, but are there different ways or strategies in which people, when they're asked to run fast, run? And does that classification, categorization, then dictate to some extent their risk? The argument around running mechanics and correcting running mechanics for me doesn't necessarily hold weight, partly because we have no idea whether anything you do in a sort of closed environment then goes out onto the field, outside of track and field, where running is the skill. But for any of the team sports, try and work on mechanics. How long does it take to influence any change, and does that actually lead to any change that's long lasting? But I think if we can start to understand if there is a way in which people run, and there's a group, a sports surgery clinic, and the King and the crew over in Ireland have a really nice sort of series of studies around athletic groin pain and change of directions and clustering different people in terms of how they change direction with groin pain. The same sort of concept here. If you understand if there's different ways that people run and run fast, if you get that categorization, does that influence their risk? And it's maybe then not saying, well, how do we change that? But it's thinking, what are the other strategies we might be able to offset or mitigate that risk? So the obvious ones I always come back to is strength and structure. Is manipulating strength and structure more important for some of those clusters more than others? There's probably a whole host of other variables there as well, but if we can get towards better approaches to assessing it in the field, then can we take that to better understand, and then we start to get the risk and understanding how we can start to mitigate that risk cycle better. It feeds into the fact that the university's kindly donated cash so we can get a dual belt triaxial instrumented treadmill as well. And so, there's going to be a push to be able to utilise that as much in our research as we possibly can too. But I think that's probably one of the main ones for us. We'll continue along the lines of some of the prospective cohort studies, looking at whether more regular intervals of assessing risk factors better enables you to identify individuals at risk. I think the upshot from what I've seen so far is it doesn't, which is probably against conventional wisdom. And maybe starting to look at a few other factors that might be involved. Other strength training interventions and the like. But I think running will be the big push that we try to make to try and close out at least the loop from our end, because I think it's a reasonable enough critique of our work is that that's been an underrepresented part of the picture, particularly the hamstring strain injury. And I think probably the other one that we want to look for, and perhaps in the long term, it's things around the spectrum in return to play, particularly for hamstring injuries, but it's a problem across a lot of sports-related injuries. There's so little data about what increases your risk of re-injury. We know a little bit, although I think we know less than what we think we know about first-time injury. But then as we go through rehab and the return to play process, what are the markers at return to play that increase or decrease risk of re-injury, particularly in that troublesome period that might be 4, 8, 10 weeks down the line at, once you complete rehab and get back out on the deck. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 studies that have looked at those things and with very few re-injuries. And it's sort of tempting to think that what we know about first-time injury then is we just sort of transplant that to return to play and recurrent injury. Now, I'm not convinced that that's the case. We don't have the data to know that. And there's only very small little snapshots of data that we had here internally. I would have done little bits and pieces of analysis of data sets that we publish for other things. And there's a really nice conference abstract from Rod Whiteley from Aspetar Sports Med, Orthopedic and Sports Med Hospital in Qatar. I think the title of it is Survival of the Weakest, where those guys who got injured and were strong were then also the ones who were more likely to go on to get re-injured. And so that is sort of paradoxical in terms of what we think about in terms of first-time injury, that being strong or pouring in a strength training stimulus is going to mitigate your risk. And even in some of our data, I've seen little bits and pieces of that, in that previous injury tends to always be the strongest variable. But when you peel down, looking at maybe some basic decision trees or things like that, you look at then previous injury, the next thing that comes up not often, but in a few of these examples is strength. And typically you would say, all right, so the weaker guys go on to get injured, but no, it actually is those stronger guys who then go on to sustain an injury in that subgroup. So we need to do more work in that space, because ultimately understanding what are the stimulus you need to try and pour into people into rehabilitation to mitigate the risk of re-injury and get them back quickly is the ultimate goal. Return to play testing or criteria is a part of that continuum. We don't really know what are those things that you want to be trying to meet to try and then get people's risks lower or risk lower. And even in the situations where people might have to try and return athletes back much quicker because there's pressure from the coach, there's big matches coming up, whatever it might be, at least if you can get an understanding of where they are at return to play, maybe you can have a little bit of a better handle as to, what that decision is around, all right, they've got to get back quick. Can I get them back that week, or do I need to push back more harder or more feverishly on the coach or the manager, or whatever it might be? So, I think they're 2 areas for us that where we probably want to have a foray into moving forward. And they'll take some time to develop, but I think in terms of where the field is at the moment, they're things we can contribute. And you look at it that way, there's a heap of great work that gets done all around the world. Just trying to think, how can we add extra elements to what we're doing or collaborate with others to help build out that picture overall. And again, the end result is trying to help people who've got to deal with those injuries, either preventing them or rehabilitating them to be able to make more informed choices with better information available.
Fantastic. And just to quickly follow up on that, David, obviously technology has been a big part of your career today, and it's the last two letters in the SPRINT acronym. And you talk about high-speed running exposures and taking those measurements into the field. Have you identified as a group any technologies, any specific metrics that you'd have to or look to measure in the field, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll have to be pretty pared back, right? So we won't be looking at heaps of stuff, and it'll probably have to be restricted to the sagittal plane, and it might even have to be restricted to the hip joint and the knee joint. So, you know, hip flexion extension, knee flexion extension, and the combination of the two. Whether that allows us to get some decent information related to muscle tendon unit lengths, strains and the like, that probably remains to be seen, right? And this is certainly no I measure you plug, but I think, you know, IMUs, broadly speaking, is probably the option that we've got to try and look and go down that path. There's been a lot of great work done in the ACL space and looking at, you know, predicting or estimating ground reaction forces during change of direction tasks, as an example. The challenge we have for hammies is that we're looking mostly at swing, and so being able to get decent data in swing is probably just a little bit harder. So I think we certainly want to try and leverage the technology that's out there. The new technologies elements in the centre is about what are the existing solutions that are out there, and how can we plug them into our established research trajectories and profiles, but also being able to, particularly for sports tech companies, have them come to us as a scope to be able to validate perhaps new tools as well, and have lab grade approaches to that as well. But yeah, from a hammy perspective and the running perspective, I think that's probably the first foray we'll make. And there's just a bit of work in it. It's just going to take time. But we've got you know, a student and a few of us now in the collective who are going to start on that journey, and we'll see how we go. It's a bit of a pet project, so I'm interested to see where we can land with it.
Fantastic. And just to close off, because I appreciate we've kept you for plenty of time, just in the field of hamstring injuries specifically, what, from your experience, are key takeaways that you can provide practitioners that are potentially listening to you speaking? What can they go away and apply straight away to maybe get better results?
Yeah. So, I mean, this relates to maybe, let's say, the pre-injury side of things, about, you know, what to measure, do you measure, how do you measure it, whatever it might be. The clearest information that is out there for hamstring injuries is if you've got the argument of, do I measure something or do I do something, the evidence being part is pretty clear to go and do it. So, yeah, whether it's exposing people to an eccentric strength training stimulus or measuring eccentric strength, you've got to get them to do that stimulus. And if you don't get them to do that stimulus regularly, then that's when you start to fall into trouble. And we see a number of examples of that, where people come to us with specific cases of athletes or individuals where, when you have compromised schedules, have short turnarounds, and you cannot get that loading in, and you lose the regularity of that loading, not doing it is the thing that brings you unstuck. And I think it's the same sort of thing with running and the running mechanics argument. You actually got to expose people to high-speed running. And high-speed running is not above 80% of max. It's above probably 95% and up to 100% of their max capacity. So appreciating that the doing and the exposing to those stimulus is more important than the measurement. And I know I've just spent probably 15 to 20 minutes talking about measurement, and maybe that's an academic argument. But at the current point in time, what we've got available to us, do it. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to measure certain things, and there'll be rationale for that. But your first line is, how can I deliver a stimulus that will drive an adaptation that should have an impact on somebody's risk? Now, the evidence isn't even available for stimulus to drive adaptation to reduce risk. There's evidence, at least from a Nordic hamstring perspective, to deliver the stimulus, reduce the risk. And what the mediator for that is, we don't yet know. So that'd be one thing. If you think about, and people often do this in their pre-season reviews, like, what are we going to do when they come back? What are we going to test? What are we going to measure? Not a problem with that, but more importantly is how are you going to build up the culture and compliance to the key stimulus in that squad, whether it's with the coach, whether it's with the athletes, to make sure there's buy-in across the board. And then I think the other one that sort of flows off the back of that is thinking about what adaptations you are trying to drive and derive from your training program, and appreciating that there's nuance in some of that. And so some of the work that we do in a consultancy sense, people come to us and they say, well, we do eccentric loading, and we do hip dominant, knee dominant work and all that sort of stuff. And then you go through them and work through them with their programs, and it's, sporadically they're missing sessions, or the intensity of the work they're trying to do isn't quite there, or it's some of the things around the integration of the basics around prescription and programming that with hammies, there is an extra layer of evidence that you can start to overlay on that. And, I know that stuff relatively well, but I can understand for someone who has to program broadly for, a strength and or strength and power phase, try and get guys to be performing well as mitigating risk of a whole host of injuries, that can be tough. But really thinking quite closely about how important it is to try and have a program with the goals in mind to drive specific adaptations, and what are the variables that you need to manipulate or flex a little bit to try and get those to see those adaptations and the perceived benefits from that. And then from a rehab perspective, I only brushed on it, I know, but using isometric contractions and pain during isometric contractions to guide progressions through rehab, from what I've seen in our lab, it just doesn't make sense. As I say, Jack Hickey's done a lot of this work, but we can have individuals who, and a certain example where 80% of individuals early on in rehab will have pain during isometric contractions, like a 90-90 isometric hamstring contraction. But when we look to then ask them to do eccentric contractions, whether they're low load or moderate or high load exercises, they actually, a far lesser proportion of those people report experiencing pain during that. It sort of doesn't make sense. You think, well, if they're painful during isometric contractions, surely with a lengthening component during eccentric contractions, that's going to be even more painful. But for whatever reason, that isn't the case. So just consider providing people in rehab an exercise that you think they might be capable of doing, see how they respond to that, and then progress or regress based on their response to that exercise, and like exercises where you try to ramp up the intensity. The isometric contractions or your clinical exams may give you some other useful information, but it probably shouldn't be there to guide your exercise progressions. And so I encourage people to think about some of that work and some of the work that I mentioned from Jack Hickey there.
David, I think that's a great snapshot of sprint in general. It's been, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I think from my side, I've got all the answers I needed. Fascinating research, some great work, really. I think Dan touched on it earlier. I think myself and Dan both admire a lot of the work coming out of ACU and sprint in general. But I think from my side, that's it. Dan, do you have any other questions? Anything else you want to touch on?
The only thing left for me to ask, David, is if people want to find out more about ACU, about the Sprint Research Centre in general, or maybe reach out to you, what's the best means of doing so? Yeah,
sure. So, I mean, from a sprint perspective, I don't know the website URL, but I think if you type in Sprint ACU, it will take you to the website, a landing page at the moment. It's got a little bit of info on there. We have an inbox as well. It's sprint@acu.edu.au. So any correspondence that people want to have with the Research Centre or me broadly can certainly go through there. In terms of ACU broadly as well, I just touched on them before, but in terms of your postgraduate degrees and in particular online degrees, we have a Masters of High Performance Sport. We have Rich Johnson, who's well known in the rugby league space and the research in that space. He's the course coordinator of the Masters of High Performance Sport. And so again, if you just type in ACU MHPS into Google, that'll take you to the Masters of High Performance Sport page. I think I'm biased, right? But I think it's one of the strongest degrees out there in the high performance space, particularly with the staff we have at ACU. And for those who want to get in touch with me, david.opar@acu.edu.au is the easiest way. I have a Twitter page, but I use it so rarely these days because Twitter's become a little bit of a cesspool. So I think it's at David Opar. I check it pretty infrequently, but if people want to go through that way, there's always an opportunity for that as well.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Well, we appreciate your time, David. Thank you for talking to us this afternoon, and thank you for watching, guys. We will see you all soon.
Great. Thanks, guys.